All right, scuba peeps. You ready to geek out on some dive planning?
Always.
Today we're diving deep, no pun intended, into no decompression limits.
It's important stuff.
Essential. So you're going through your scuba search right. You're going to be hitting those books, and you need to know how long you can stay down, how deep you can go, all that good stuff.
You don't want to have to do extra stops on the way up.
Right. Nobody wants to do that. And to help us navigate these sometimes confusing waters, we've got an expert on board.
Happy to be here. I'm excited to break it all down. Understanding these tables is like unlocking a whole new world of underwater exploring and doing it safely.
Well, I like the sound of that. Keys to a whole new world.
Yeah,
Much better than getting bent, am I right?
100%. Safety is key.
So these dive tables, they might seem a little intimidating at first glance, but it's really all about keeping us safe, right?
Absolutely. Like, it all boils down to nitrogen and how our bodies react to it at depth.
Right. Nitrogen narcosis, like that's a whole other thing.
A whole other podcast. But the short version is when we dive, our bodies absorb nitrogen from the air that we breathe. And the deeper we go and the longer we stay down there, the more nitrogen we absorb. And if we stay down too long or come up too quickly, that nitrogen can form bubbles in our tissues.
Ouch.
Kind of like opening a soda bottle too fast.
Not the bubbles we're looking for.
Not at all. These tables, they essentially give us the guidelines so that we don't turn into a human soda bottle.
Okay, so they give us the no decompression limits, or NDLs for short. So let's say I'm looking at this reef, right? It's down at 18 meters. I'm super stoked about it. I grab my dive tables. I find 18 meters in the depth column.
You're good to go.
And it says I have 60 minutes. Awesome. A whole hour to explore.
Well, hold on. Remember those keys I mentioned earlier? There's a little bit of a trick to using them. You see how those depths on the table, they kind of jump around? So what if you want to dive to 20 meters, which isn't specifically listed on the table?
Yeah, he got a point. So 18 meters is 60 minutes. It goes from 18 meters to 21 meters.
Right, so do you just estimate?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, like, yeah, maybe split the difference or something, but I have a feeling that's not the right answer.
You're close. But it's actually best to round up to the next highest depth listed on the table. Always play it safe.
Okay, so even though I'm diving at 20 meters, I use the NDL for 21 meters, which is 48 minutes.
Got it. So always round up. Be a little more conservative, never less.
Exactly. You got it. And there's actually a really fascinating scientific reason for rounding up. But the short version is, it's always better to overestimate the amount of nitrogen you've absorbed rather than underestimate it.
Right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Error on the side of caution, especially with diving.
Safety first.
But something tells me there's more to these NDLs than just depth and time, right? What about when I wanted to, do multiple dives in a day? Like, I'm sure a lot of people, they go out on these dive boats. They're not just doing one dive. What happens then?
Yeah, so that's when things get a little more interesting. And by interesting, I mean we might have to do a few more calculations. And that's when we start talking about continuous dives and repetitive dives.
Oh, more calculations.
Yeah.
All right, lay it on me. So continuous dives versus repetitive dives. What's the difference? So break it down for me. Continuous dives, repetitive dives, all that good stuff. What am I looking at?
All right, so it all comes down to that surface interval. How long you're staying above water between your dives. So picture this. You surface from an awesome dive, you're climbing back on the boat, and you realize you dropped your dive light. Right there. Just a quick little dip to go grab it.
Happens all the time.
Right, so that, my friend, is what we call a continuous dive. Basically, anything within 10 minutes of surfacing.
Okay, so if I'm going back down for round 2 real quick, even if it's shallow,
Yeah.
it's considered continuous. Makes sense. But what's the big deal with classifying it like that? What's the difference?
Because even though that second dive was super quick and you're not going that deep, your body is still carrying over that nitrogen from the first dive. So we have to treat the whole thing, both dives, as one big dive when we're figuring out your no decompression limit.
Wait, really? Even if it's way shallower, that second dive. So like say my first dive was, I don't know, 18 meters for 30 minutes. And then I go back down to 5 meters for like 5 minutes to grab my light.
You still got to consider that 18-meter NDL, which we know is 60 minutes. So we add up the time on both dives, which would be 35 minutes in this case, and then we compare that to the no decompression limit for the deepest depth of either dive.
Wow. Okay, so that's kind of sneaky. So these little quick dips back down could actually be riskier than they seem.
Exactly. In fact, the source material I was looking at actually mentioned a close call that a diver had because of this.
Oh, no.
He surfaced from a 25-meter dive, and he realized he'd left his camera down there, so he just figured, it'll be fine, just 5 meters, I'll just scoop down there real quick. Didn't even bother checking his dive computer. Ended up having to take a trip to the decompression chamber, so it's a good reminder. Even those quick little trips back down, it's important to keep that nitrogen clock in mind.
Yeah, I'm getting a much better picture now. It's all making
Mm-hmm.
a lot more sense. Okay, so what about, I come back up from that first dive. I've got my surface interval. We're eating lunch. We're hanging out on the boat. Maybe an hour or two goes by. And then I'm ready for my second dive of the day. That's where repetitive dives come in, right?
Exactly. Now, if you have a surface interval of 15 hours or more, you're pretty much good to go. Your body's basically back to square one. Like, you can treat it like it's a brand new single dive.
Nice.
But anything less than that 15-hour mark, you're still carrying over some of that residual nitrogen.
Right, right. Residual nitrogen, or as the cool kids call it, .RNT. But, okay, so how do we actually figure out how much nitrogen we're carrying over? How do we calculate all this stuff? This is where those fancy dive tables come into play.
You got it. Think of your NDL like a big old tank of air. And each dive that you do, you're using up some of that air. The RNT is basically like checking the gauge on that tank after a dive to see how much air you've got left before your next one.
I like that and visualizing it.
And just like with a normal air tank, you don't want to run out at the bottom, right?
Right. Bad news.
Exactly. So there's a specific table that you would use, and it takes into account the depth and the time of that previous dive as well as your surface interval. That tells you, all right, this is how much RNT you're carrying over.
So the longer my surface interval, the more that tank is refilling, so to speak.
You got it. So let's say, for example, you do your calculations and you find that your RNT from that first dive is 20 minutes. That means you essentially have 20 minutes less bottom time available on your second dive compared to if it were a completely fresh single dive.
Gotcha, gotcha. So I find the NDL for, whatever depth I want to go to on that second dive, and then I just subtract 20 minutes from that.
Exactly. You're getting it. You're a natural.
I'm picking it up. So really, it's like a little underwater math problem that we have to solve before each dive.
That's a good way to look at it. And here's a little pro tip from the source material that I was looking at. If you know you're planning to do multiple dives in a day and they're at different depths, it's actually generally safer to do the deeper dive first.
Interesting. Okay.
Because you're going to have some residual nitrogen anyway from that deeper dive, but you'll use up less of your no decompression limit on that second shallower dive.
Smart.
Huh.
Smart. I like that a lot. Okay, so we've got our NDLs, surface intervals, residual nitrogen, all this good stuff. What else should we be thinking about? Anything else on the safety checklist before we jump in the water?
So much good stuff to keep in mind, right?
Yeah.
So many things to think about. Speaking of things to think about, we got to talk about those red numbers that were mentioned in the source material. They kind of popped out at me like, warning, warning.
Yeah.
What's the deal with those? Yeah, so those are actually there to give us a little extra margin of safety. We were talking about those no decompression limits. Those are like kind of your hard limits. But those red numbers, they indicate what's called the red zone on the dive tables. And it's basically like a buffer zone. So even if you're still technically within your calculated NDL for a certain depth, staying out of that red zone means you're even less likely to experience any decompression sickness.
Okay, so it's like the dive table saying, hey, technically, you could push it to the limit.
It's possible, right? And especially because those tables, they use like kind of an average person as a model, right? They don't take into account your individual factors.
I like how fit you are, how
Mm.
much you're exerting yourself, even things like if you're dehydrated or not, right?
Yeah. All of that can actually play a role. And speaking of staying safe, the source also recommended some good practices. Things like always incorporating a safety stop into your dive plan. Basically, just taking a couple minutes to pause at like 15 feet or so on your way back up to the surface, just to give your body a little extra time to off-gas some of that nitrogen.
Ah, okay, so it's like a little pit stop before you get to the surface, right? Let your body get used to being back in shallower water.
Exactly. And they recommend, a 3-minute safety stop for most dives. And then if you've been in that red zone or you've been diving for a longer time, to do a longer 5-minute safety stop, just to be extra safe.
Always a good idea. All right, so we've got our dive tables, safety stops, making sure that we're being conservative with our NDLs. What else is important here? What else should we be keeping in mind when it comes to staying safe with these no decompression limits?
Honestly, one of the most important things, and the source really emphasized this, is just clear communication with your dive buddy, especially if you're doing multiple dives. Making sure that, you're both on the same page in terms of what depths you're going to, how long you're staying down, how much residual nitrogen you might be carrying over, because it really is a team effort down there.
Safety in numbers, for
Yeah,
sure,
sure.
right? We don't want one buddy, free diving off into the depths while the other one's carefully sticking to the plan.
Exactly.
Teamwork makes the dream work, right?
100%. And, keep in mind, too, this deep dive that we've been doing is really just scratching the surface. Like,
Yeah.
during your actual open water certification dives, you're going to go into a lot more depth with your instructor. They're going to actually get hands-on with those dive tables, and it'll all start to click even more.
Right. This is just to get our listeners prepped,
Yeah.
right? A little intro before they go and get their hands dirty. Speaking of which, those dive tables we've been talking about? The source material did mention that those are specifically for altitudes up to 700 meters.
Oh, yeah.
Which begs the question, how does altitude actually affect no decompression limits?
That's a great question. It's actually a whole other layer to this because obviously, as you go higher in altitude, the air pressure changes. And so that can affect how much nitrogen our bodies absorb at a given depth.
Right, so those mountain lake dives, whole different ball game.
Exactly.
It's like every time we answer one question, it opens up a whole new can of worms.
It's amazing, isn't it?
That's why we dive deep, right?
Exactly. Pun intended.
But for today's deep dive, I think we've gone deep enough, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think we're good for now.
We don't want to overload our listeners with too much information all at once.
Yeah.
Got to give them time to digest.
Gotta let it all sink in.
Exactly. So remember, everyone, this is just the start of the journey, right? Proper scuba training, super, super important for exploring the underwater world safely and responsibly.
Could not agree more.
We always say safety first. Be sure to check out our show notes. We'll have some links to some really great resources where you can dive even deeper, no pun intended, into the world of dive tables, decompression theory. It's fascinating stuff. But until next time, everyone, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into no decompression limits. Happy diving.
Happy diving.